By the time Peter realized the truth, love had already packed its bags and left their home. What was once laughter had turned into silence so heavy it could choke you. He sat in the dark that night, staring at the walls that had heard too many arguments and too few apologies. Mabel was in the bedroom, crying quietly, not because she wanted to, but because she didn't know what else to do. It wasn't always like this. Once upon a time, they were the kind of couple people admired. Two people who made love look simple. But love is never simple. It's a fragile thing that demands care, and when pride walks in, love quietly slips out. That night, Peter wanted to speak. He wanted to ask, when did we lose each other? But he didn't. And that silence was the final nail in the coffin of a marriage that had already begun to die. But stories like this never start with fights. They start with laughter. It began years earlier, on a day that meant nothing to the world, but everything to them. Peter wasn't the kind of man who attracted attention. He was quiet, thoughtful, always a step away from the crowd. He believed in peace, in order, in plans that made sense. Mabel, on the other hand, was light itself. She was the kind of woman who made people turn twice when she walked by, not because she was loud, but because she had that rare glow of confidence. When Peter first met her, she was arguing about something, passionately, fearlessly, as if the world needed to hear her opinion. He watched her from across the room, a smile creeping up his face. She wasn't perfect, but she was alive, and he hadn't realized how quiet his own life had become until she walked into it. He introduced himself clumsily, as men like Peter do when they meet women who unsettle them. But Mabel liked his awkward calmness. It felt safe. It felt genuine. They started talking, and somehow that conversation never ended. Weeks turned into months, and before they knew it, they were inseparable. Their love grew not through grand gestures, but through small, ordinary moments. A shared meal, late-night talks, laughter over something that wasn't even funny. The kind of moments that feel like forever when you're in them. Peter believed he'd found his peace. Mabel believed she found her partner. And for a while, they were both right. Everyone around them could see it. The chemistry, the warmth, the way they understood each other without words. Even Peter's friends would tease him. You better not lose that one, oh. Women like that don't come twice. He would smile and say, I know. But the problem with love is, it doesn't warn you when it starts to fade. It doesn't make noise. It just changes shape. When Peter proposed, it was quiet, simple, and sincere. Mabel said yes without thinking twice. She didn't need diamonds or fireworks. She just wanted him. The wedding was small, filled with laughter and prayers, the kind of day where everyone says, this one will last. And for a while, it did. They built their little home, filled it with dreams and plans. Mabel would tease Peter for his seriousness, and he would shake his head pretending to be annoyed. They had their disagreements, of course. Every couple does. But love always won, at least at the start. But somewhere between work, bills, and responsibilities, something began to shift. Mabel was restless. She wanted more. Not more love, but more life. She had ideas, business plans, ambitions. She wanted to start something of her own. Peter wasn't against it. He just wanted to be sure they were ready. He'd say, let's wait. Let's plan it properly. But to Mabel, wait sounded like don't. She started to see him differently. The man she once admired for his patience now felt like an obstacle to her dreams. And Peter, well, he started to feel like he was losing her to something he couldn't compete with. Love began to turn into negotiation. Every decision felt like a battlefield, every word a test. Yet they still smiled for the world. They still held hands at gatherings. They still said, "We're fine." But they both knew something was changing. And the truth about marriage is, it never breaks suddenly. It breaks slowly, one compromise, one unspoken resentment at a time. The first real crack came in the form of small choices that seemed harmless at the time. Mabel had always been ambitious, but now her ambition began to pull her away from Peter, even when he was right there. It started with late nights at work, excuses that sounded reasonable, and promises that were quietly broken. Peter noticed, of course, but he told himself it was temporary, a season of growth, nothing more. He told himself love was enough, that trust could bridge the small distance forming between them. But distance doesn't announce itself. It creeps in quietly. It settles in the spaces between shared meals, in the pauses during conversations, in the moments when laughter no longer reaches the eyes. Peter tried to speak up. He tried to ask gently about the late nights, the whispered phone calls, the extra hours Mabel spent away. But every time he did, she reassured him, smiled brightly, and convinced him it was nothing. And like the fool he was, Peter believed her. Mabel, on her side, was torn. She wasn't trying to deceive him out of malice. She convinced herself that she was protecting them both. She thought that if she could just make the right decisions, take the right risks, then one day he would see and understand. But the truth she didn't want to admit, not even to herself, was that keeping secrets, even small ones, changes you. It changes the way you see love, the way you see the person you love. It shifts the balance of a home until the weight becomes unbearable. Their first fight over this invisible tension came without warning. It was nothing at first, a small disagreement over money. Peter wanted to save, Mabel wanted to invest. Their voices were calm at first, measured, but then the old fear surfaced. The fear of being misunderstood, the fear of being ignored. Words were exchanged, each carrying weight the other hadn't anticipated. And then, silence. That cold, heavy silence that stretches from one room to the next. For days, they avoided each other. The house that had once been warm with laughter became a place of quiet observation. They moved like strangers, polite but distant. The small cracks that had begun forming now threatened to become chasms. Friends noticed. Family noticed, and everyone, even Peter and Mabel themselves, feared the inevitable. Then came the first mistake, the one that would change everything. It wasn't an act of betrayal in the dramatic sense people expect from movies. It wasn't a shouting match, a secret affair, or a public humiliation. No, it was smaller than that, almost invisible to anyone who lived it. Mabel made a choice she believed was for the betterment of their future, a choice she thought Peter would eventually understand. She reached out for help, financial help, an outside investor to fund a project she had been nurturing quietly. On paper, it seemed reasonable. In practice, it was catastrophic. The problem wasn't the action itself. It was the secrecy. She didn't tell Peter. She didn't involve him. She thought she was protecting them both, giving him the luxury of surprise when it all worked out. But in doing so, she had built a wall between them, one brick at a time. And walls, once built, are heavy. They are cold. They do not whisper apologies. They do not bend for love. Peter found out by accident, as he often does in tragedies. A misplaced receipt, a casual comment from a friend, a tiny detail that revealed what he had not been told. And in that moment, the quiet fear that had been lurking in his chest exploded. He felt betrayed, not because Mabel had taken action. He could forgive ambition, but because she had taken action without him. Every late night, every whispered phone call, every small lie now became magnified, 1,000 times heavier than the truth alone. Mabel saw the shift immediately. She noticed the way Peter's eyes hardened, the way he spoke with clipped words, the way he withdrew. She tried to explain, tried to justify, but words were weak against the tide of disappointment and hurt he carried. For Peter, it wasn't just about the money or the project. It was about trust, the foundation of their love. And once that foundation cracked, even the strongest walls cannot hold up a house. From that day, their conversations became battles. Simple disagreements spiraled into arguments. Silence became punishment. The warmth they once shared was replaced with tension that neither knew how to soothe. Friends tried to intervene, family offered advice, but the chasm had grown too wide for casual remedies. Each apology was met with doubt, each reassurance was questioned, and in their hearts both of them felt the slow, crushing truth that love, no matter how strong, cannot survive alone without honesty. And yet, amidst all this, there were moments of tenderness. Peter remembered why he loved Mabel. Her laugh, the way she tilted her head when she thought, the small acts of kindness that had drawn him in years before. Mabel remembered why she loved Peter, his calm, steady presence, the way he could make her feel safe even in chaos, the patience he carried like a shield for both of them. But memory alone does not mend a fractured trust. Speculatively, we can see that this is where many marriages falter. It is not the grand betrayals that end love. It is the small missteps, the decisions made in isolation, the pride that prevents a simple confession. Peter and Mabel's story is universal because it is subtle, insidious, and achingly familiar. The first mistake is never the loudest. It is the one that whispers, unseen, until it has already done its work. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. The house remained the same, but the people in it changed. They went through motions, breakfast together, evening walks, polite nods, but the connection had fractured. Every smile was weighed, every touch measured. Love was still there, yes, but buried beneath layers of hurt, hesitation, and fear. Mabel tried desperately to repair it in her own way. She offered explanations. She worked harder to show commitment. She smiled and tried to make the home feel alive again, but Peter's patience had been tested beyond measure. He listened. He nodded. He tried to understand, but a part of him had already withdrawn. And in that withdrawal, Mabel felt the sting of a distance she had never intended to create, but had no power to undo. By the time the next argument came, it was no longer about the initial mistake. It was about everything that followed. The pride, the miscommunication, the small resentment stacked like kindle. One word, one look, and the fire was set. For weeks they walked on eggshells, pretending for the world that everything was fine, while inside both knew it was anything but. And that is the cruel truth about mistakes in marriage. They are not single events. They are chains of choices, small and large, that link together until escape seems impossible. One moment Mabel thought she was protecting their future. One moment, Peter thought he could forgive without understanding. And one moment later, they were trapped in a storm of their own making. The days that followed the first mistake felt like walking through a fog. Peter moved through the house with quiet resentment, his mind replaying every late night, every whisper he hadn't heard, every moment Mabel had chosen ambition over transparency. Each step he took felt heavy, weighted with things left unsaid. He tried to act normal in front of friends and family, but even laughter became foreign, a mask he couldn't fully wear. Mabel, on her side, carried a burden of guilt she hadn't anticipated. She had thought her choices were clever, protective, even loving. But now she understood the gravity of what she had done. Every time she looked at Peter, she saw the cracks forming in his expression, the guarded way he approached her. She wanted to reach out, to speak, to pour her heart wide open, but fear stopped her. Fear that the wrong words would push them further apart. Fear that the damage was already too great to mend. And so the quiet continued. A silence that was more suffocating than any argument, more powerful than any gesture of love. They existed in the same space, but lived in separate worlds. Peter in the realm of betrayal and disappointment, Mabel in the world of ambition and regret. Both wanted to reach the other, but neither knew the path back. It was in this silence that the next set of mistakes crept in. Small decisions, seemingly innocent, began to undermine them further. Mabel started staying late at the office more frequently, often returning home past midnight. She told herself it was necessary for her growth, for their future, for the life they had dreamed of. But Peter saw it differently. Every late night was a reminder of distance, of secrets kept, of trust compromised. He stopped asking questions, stopped expressing concern, and began keeping a journal of his own thoughts, a private witness to the unraveling of their marriage. Arguments became more frequent, more intense, and yet oddly hollow. They shouted, not out of anger alone, but out of frustration with themselves, with the circumstances, and with each other. The smallest disagreements, what to eat, how to pay bills, which movie to watch, became battlegrounds. Both of them fought, not to win, but because they were desperate to feel heard, to feel seen, to feel like they mattered to the other person. Mabel noticed the change in Peter. The warmth she once relied upon was gone, replaced by quiet observation. He was present, but only in the physical sense. Emotionally, he had withdrawn into a place she could not reach. And she, in turn, responded the way people often do when afraid of loss. She pushed harder. She worked harder. She smiled more. She tried to fill the void with effort. But effort cannot replace connection. Effort cannot rebuild trust once it has been fractured. One night, after another long day filled with tension, Peter confronted her. His voice was calm but firm, carrying the weight of months of disappointment. "Why do you keep hiding things from me, Mabel? Why can't you just tell me?" Mabel's eyes filled with tears, but she held back. She wanted to explain, to pour out everything she had felt and done, but the words seemed inadequate. "I thought I was protecting us. I wanted to make sure we were safe, that we were secure." Peter shook his head slowly. "Protection? By hiding things from me? By making choices without me?" She couldn't answer. The truth was complicated. Her intentions were good, but the consequences had become a storm she could not control. And Peter, for his part, realized that love was no longer enough. He had loved her through silence, through half-truths, through the small betrayals that now loomed large. But even love has limits, especially when trust is compromised repeatedly. From that night on, the house became a battlefield of passive aggression and small resentments. Peter stopped initiating conversation, Mabel stopped volunteering information.
Each lived in fear of the other's reactions, both convinced that any misstep could ignite another fight. And in that fear, their love shrank, retreating from the open spaces of the home into corners where it could no longer breathe freely. Speculatively, one might say that this is where many marriages begin their downward spiral. It is not the big betrayals that destroy. It is the accumulation of small fractures, left unchecked. One lie, one omission, one misinterpreted gesture becomes the seed of mistrust. And when both partners are afraid to communicate honestly, the seeds grow into walls that are hard to tear down. Mabel, desperate to reclaim a sense of control, made another choice, one that she believed would help, but instead pushed them further apart. She engaged with an outside advisor for her project, someone who didn't know Peter personally. She believed the advisor's involvement was necessary, that it would secure her dreams and, indirectly, their future. But again, she didn't tell Peter. And when Peter found out, as he inevitably did, the distance between them became nearly insurmountable. By now, their arguments were no longer about specific incidents. They were about everything, about fear, ambition, pride, and disappointment. A glance could spark an argument. A tone of voice could trigger a battle. The home, once a sanctuary, had become a place of emotional warfare. Yet amidst the chaos, both Peter and Mabel were trying, desperately, clumsily, to hold on to something they both knew was slipping away. And there were moments, fleeting and rare, when the old love flickered. Peter would catch her looking out the window, her eyes distant, and remember the laughter they once shared. Mabel would see him lost in thought, remembering the small gestures of care he had given her over the years. These moments were brief, like sparks in a dark room, but they reminded them both of what had been and what could still be if only they found the courage to bridge the distance. But courage is hard when fear is present, and fear had settled into their marriage like an uninvited guest. Every decision Mabel made was tinged with fear. Fear of judgment, fear of rejection, fear of losing what she loved. And every decision Peter made was tinged with the same. Fear of betrayal, fear of disappointment, fear that the home he had cherished was slipping through his fingers. As time passed, small mistakes accumulated. A forgotten promise, a raised voice over trivial matters, a misunderstanding turned into a silent grudge. Each acted like a stone thrown into still water, sending ripples that neither could control. And in this emotional turbulence, the real tragedy unfolded. Their love, though present, was buried under layers of hurt, pride, and miscommunication. Speculatively, it can be assumed that this is where many couples find themselves trapped, aware of the problem but unable to act without risking further damage. Peter and Mabel were caught in that liminal space, both willing to fight for their marriage but unsure of how to navigate the minefield of their own emotions. And so the pattern continued. Each day brought small battles. Each night carried quiet regrets. They both yearned for connection, yet the weight of past choices made it nearly impossible. Their home, their love, and their dreams all hung by threads, fraying with each passing day. By the time the next month rolled in, Peter and Mabel were no longer the couple people remembered. The laughter that had once echoed through their home was replaced by quiet footsteps and careful glances. Every interaction was calculated, measured, as if one wrong move could ignite a fire that neither could control. And in some ways, it already had. Mabel tried desperately to justify herself, to prove that her choices were made for both their benefit. She spent hours explaining budgets, plans, and projections. She thought if Peter could only see the logic, the reasoning, the necessity of what she was doing, he would forgive her. But forgiveness is not born from reason alone. It is born from understanding, and understanding cannot exist when the foundation of trust has been shaken. Peter listened, nodded, sometimes even smiled, but inside, the wound had grown. It was no longer a small cut that could heal. It had become a scar, raw and tender, sensitive to every movement, every word. He began noticing the little things he hadn't before. The way Mabel's phone never left her hand, the sudden trips she took, the tiny omissions in her explanations. Each small thing was magnified through the lens of betrayal, and the lens, once clear, was now cracked. One evening, after another tense dinner, Peter finally voiced what had been building inside him. His voice was calm, but the words carried a weight she could not ignore. "Mabel, I can't keep pretending everything is fine. I feel like I'm losing you, like I've been losing you for a long time and I didn't even know it." Mabel's throat tightened. She wanted to speak, to explain, to beg him to understand, but the words caught like a stone in her chest. I didn't mean to. I thought I was protecting us. But Peter could not hear it that way anymore. In his mind, protection without trust was nothing but deception. And in that instant, the fragile walls of their relationship cracked even further. Speculatively, it is clear that this is a common turning point in many marriages. One partner believes they are acting in the other's best interest, while the other interprets those actions as secrecy, dishonesty, or betrayal. Both intentions are valid, but the misalignment creates a chasm that is difficult to cross without courage, humility, and openness. From that night, Mabel began noticing how Peter's presence felt distant, even in the same room. He no longer laughed at her jokes. He no longer asked about her day. He had become a man watching, waiting, analyzing, and the warmth they had once shared was now a memory. Mabel tried everything to reconnect, small gestures, handwritten notes, gifts, but each attempt seemed to emphasize the distance rather than bridge it. The tension spilled into their friends' circles. Casual dinners, friendly outings, visits from family. Each event became a silent battlefield. People noticed. Some asked questions, tried to offer advice, but Mabel and Peter only smiled politely, keeping the truth hidden behind practiced expressions. But the truth has a way of leaking out, and soon those closest to them could sense the fractures growing wider. And then the first irreversible mistake happened. It wasn't loud, it wasn't violent, and it wasn't planned. It was a moment of weakness, a split-second decision made in fear and frustration. Mabel, exhausted from trying to prove herself, decided to bypass Peter completely in a matter that involved both their finances. She signed a contract, sent documents, and committed them to an agreement without consulting him. In her mind, it was necessary. She told herself that if Peter trusted her enough, he would forgive her after seeing the outcome. But she did not anticipate the magnitude of what she had done. For Peter, this was more than a breach of trust. It was a confirmation that their partnership had been undermined. The foundation, already shaky, collapsed under the weight of her action. Peter discovered the contract 2 days later. The shock hit him like a wave, pulling all the anger, frustration, and disappointment he had buried to the surface at once. Words were not enough. Yelling was not enough. The quiet, polite arguments of the past weeks escalated into raw, unrestrained confrontation. "How could you make this decision without me?" he demanded, his voice cracking. "Everything we built, everything we promised each other, was it worth nothing?" Mabel, for the first time in months, felt her control slip. She wanted to cry, to explain, to reach for him, but he stepped back. The emotional distance that had been growing finally became a physical space she could not cross. She realized, with a painful clarity, that her choice, however well-intentioned, had set them on a path from which there was no easy return. From that night onward, their marriage existed in a state of quiet war. Each interaction, no matter how small, was scrutinized. Every gesture, every word, every pause carried meaning, often the wrong meaning. They spoke, yes, but they spoke with caution, as if one wrong phrase could undo whatever fragile piece remained. And in that cautious communication, intimacy was lost, replaced by suspicion, fear, and resentment. Speculatively, this stage demonstrates how small mistakes, compounded by secrecy and pride, can escalate into irreversible damage. Both Peter and Mabel acted out of love and care, yet both miscalculated the consequences. This is the cruel irony of marriage. Intentions, no matter how pure, are insufficient without transparency, humility, and the willingness to confront uncomfortable truths together. And yet, even in the midst of the storm, moments of tenderness remained. Peter would occasionally glance at Mabel and remember the woman he fell in love with. Her energy, her courage, the way she had once made life feel limitless. Mabel would catch Peter lost in thought and see the man who had once been her anchor, the man whose calm presence had steadied her in moments of fear. But these glimpses were fleeting. The distance they had created was not easily erased. Weeks turned into months. The house, once full of warmth, was now a place of silent tension. Meals were eaten in separate rooms. Conversations were minimal. Nights were spent in solitude, each partner lost in their own thoughts, replaying the events that had led them here. And in the midst of it all, both Peter and Mabel realized something chilling. Love was still present, but it was trapped beneath layers of hurt, fear, and regret. By the time the next confrontation came, it was inevitable. The mistakes had accumulated like snow, each one heavier than the last, until the weight of the past could no longer be carried quietly. One argument, one misinterpreted gesture, one failure to forgive, and the consequences would ripple outward, touching everything they had built together. This was the stage of no return. The first major, irreversible mistake had been made. The marriage, though not yet ended, was forever changed. And in that change lay the heart of the tragedy, not a single act, not a loud betrayal, but the slow, relentless accumulation of small decisions, missteps, and silences that had grown into a storm neither could withstand alone.
Peter stared at the doorway as Mabel disappeared into the bedroom, the slam of the door echoing like a gunshot in the silence of their home. It wasn't just a door closing, it was the final acknowledgement that the space between them had become unbridgeable. Months of tension, months of unspoken words, months of misjudged intentions had finally solidified into a wall neither could scale. Mabel sat on the edge of the bed, her hands clutching a pillow as if it could absorb the guilt and fear that swirled inside her. She had tried, oh, how she had tried, to make things right, to explain, to reason, to reach Peter through the fog that had settled over their love. But tonight, the effort felt futile. Every word, every gesture, every attempt had been met with distance, and for the first time, she wondered if the distance was permanent. Peter moved through the living room, his mind replaying every moment of their unraveling. He remembered the laughter, the quiet evenings, the small acts of care that had once defined their relationship. And he remembered the betrayals, the omissions, the broken trust, each one carving away at the foundation they had built together. He loved her still, yes, but love alone was no longer enough. The love that brought them together remained, but it was buried beneath layers of disappointment and fear. Both Peter and Mabel had acted from places of care, yet the lack of transparency had transformed care into conflict. The breaking point came quietly, yet with the weight of inevitability.
It started with a conversation that should have been simple, about a dinner arrangement, about a choice of weekend plans. But it quickly escalated, each sentence loaded with months of unspoken resentment. Peter's voice, calm at first, grew sharp, precise, cutting through the tension that had become almost tangible. "Mabel, do you even realize what your decisions have done to us?" he asked, his eyes hard, voice shaking with a mix of anger and heartbreak. "I trusted you. I gave you everything, my heart, my home, my life, and every time I turned around, you made choices without me. How am I supposed to feel safe in this marriage?" Mabel's throat tightened. She wanted to cry, to beg, to tell him that she had only ever wanted the best for them, but the words felt trapped, unable to escape the knot of fear and shame that had grown inside her. "She thought I was helping," she whispered. "I didn't mean to hurt you." But meaning is not enough when trust is broken. Peter's frustration flared, and in that flare, years of suppressed emotions, disappointment, fear, anger, and sorrow erupted. Their voices rose, echoing through the house, each word a spark in a room already full of flammable tension. The fight lasted hours, not in the form of shouting alone, but in the careful, precise dissection of every decision, every misstep, every quiet betrayal that had led them here. Mabel tried to explain herself, to show that her actions were not malicious, but Peter heard only omission, secrecy, and repeated mistakes. And in that hearing, the fragile connection that had survived months of tension shattered completely. For Peter, this was more than an argument. It was an awakening to the reality that the marriage he thought unbreakable had been eroded by small, insidious actions over time. And for Mabel, it was a revelation of the damage her choices, however well-intended, had caused. Both were trapped in a storm of their own making, unable to find a path back without confronting truths they had long avoided. This is where many couples find themselves teetering on the edge. The realization that love alone cannot repair repeated breaches of trust often marks the beginning of permanent change. At this stage, reconciliation is possible only through radical honesty, vulnerability, and an acknowledgement of the emotional harm inflicted, all things neither Peter nor Mabel had fully mastered yet. The night stretched endlessly. Neither spoke, but both felt the heavy presence of unspoken words, the accumulation of months of resentment pressing down on them like a physical weight. Sleep was impossible. Rest was impossible. The home, once a sanctuary, now felt like a cage, enclosing them in the consequences of their choices. Mabel reached out eventually, a small hand brushing against Peter's arm in a tentative gesture. It was an attempt, perhaps the first true attempt, to reconnect. But Peter recoiled slightly, startled by the intimacy he had been yearning for and simultaneously fearing. "Not tonight," he said quietly, though the words were anything but gentle. She nodded, understanding, and in that nod lay both acceptance and despair. She realized that love alone, even when fierce and genuine, could not erase months of accumulated mistakes. It could not erase the invisible walls that had grown between them, walls built from secrecy, pride, and miscommunication. Days passed, and with them came the realization that the marriage had entered a new phase, one of survival rather than joy. They continued to live together, to perform the rituals of partnership, but the emotional bond that had once been effortless now required laborious effort. Every word, every action, every smile carried the weight of past mistakes, each one a reminder that trust, once broken, is not easily restored. Peter found himself questioning everything, every decision, every plan, every moment of quiet suspicion became a reminder of how easily a marriage could unravel. Mabel too questioned herself, wondering if her ambition, her independence, her choices had been selfish, whether love required sacrifice beyond what she had known. Both partners experience a mixture of grief, regret, and anxiety. They oscillate between desire to reconnect and fear of further damage. Their story reflects the universal human experience of love tested by imperfection, where intentions collide with consequences in ways that are often unpredictable and painful. And yet, even amidst the turmoil, there were glimpses of hope, brief, fragile sparks, a shared memory, a moment of laughter, a gentle touch, reminded them both that the foundation of their love, though battered, had not completely crumbled. These moments were rare, yet powerful, offering the possibility that if approached with courage, honesty, and humility, repair might still be possible. But the cost of waiting, of silence, of unresolved tension was high. Each day without communication, each choice made in isolation, each unspoken fear added layers to the chasm between them. And in that chasm, both Peter and Mabel were at risk of losing not just their marriage, but also their sense of self, their capacity to trust, and their belief in the love that had once been their greatest joy.
The following morning, the house felt heavier than it had ever been. The sun shone, mocking them with its brightness, while inside, Peter and Mabel moved like shadows, cautious and strained. Every glance was measured, every word rehearsed. The intimacy they once took for granted was replaced by the anxiety of anticipation, wondering if the next conversation would be another spark or another flame to consume what remained. Peter sat at the kitchen table, staring at a cup of coffee that had long gone cold. His mind replayed the fight from the night before, dissecting every sentence, every gesture, every pause. He wanted to reach out, to bridge the silence, but fear anchored him in place. Fear that any step he took might be met with resistance, anger, or even apathy. He realized that the marriage he had cherished was no longer a source of comfort. It had become a source of tension, a minefield where every interaction carried risk. Mabel entered the kitchen cautiously, her expression carefully neutral. She wanted to apologize, to speak from the heart, but words felt insufficient. The emotional chasm between them had grown wider than either could admit. "Good morning," she said softly, placing a plate in front of him. Peter looked up, his expression unreadable. He nodded. "Barely. Morning," he replied. It was not warmth, not connection, it was acknowledgement. The day unfolded with quiet tension, each moment highlighting the distance that had grown between them. Small gestures that once conveyed love now carried layers of meaning. A touch was scrutinized. A word was analyzed. Every glance was a question. Every silence a judgment. And in this new reality, Mabel began to feel a creeping despair. She had always been independent, ambitious, capable, but now her actions, even those meant to protect or enhance their life, were interpreted as betrayals. The weight of expectation, combined with the fear of further mistakes, was suffocating. By afternoon, the tension reached a boiling point. A minor disagreement about dinner plans escalated into a full-blown argument, the likes of which neither had experienced before. Peter's voice was sharp, precise, cutting through the air like a knife. "Why can't you just involve me? Why do you keep making decisions alone? Do you even care what I think?" Mabel's eyes welled up with tears. She had never intended to hurt him. Every decision she had made, every step she had taken, she had done with the hope of securing their future. But her intentions were meaningless to Peter now. I thought I was helping," she stammered. "I didn't think it would matter." But in Peter's mind, it did matter. Every choice she made in isolation was a confirmation that their partnership, the bond they had promised each other, was fractured beyond repair. The small betrayals, the secrets, the omissions, they had piled up like snow, pressing down until the house of their marriage groaned under the weight. Repeated breaches of trust, even if unintentional, erode the foundation so subtly that when it finally collapses, both partners are blindsided by the force of its fall. The first major breakdown is rarely about a single event. It is the accumulation of months, sometimes years, of small mistakes left unresolved. As the argument continued, the emotional distance that had been quietly growing erupted into raw confrontation. Words that had been held back for months were finally unleashed. Peter's frustration, anger, and heartbreak collided with Mabel's guilt, fear, and desperation. Each accusation, each denial, each plea echoed through the house, leaving an invisible scar on every wall, every floor, every piece of furniture that had once witnessed love. At some point, the fight turned inward. Peter questioned himself as much as he questioned Mabel. Have I failed? Did I miss the signs? Was I too blind to see what was happening? And Mabel, in turn, questioned her own choices. Have I ruined everything? Was I too selfish? Did I betray him even when I thought I was protecting us? Their love, though still present, was caught between these two currents of doubt and regret. It was fragile, vulnerable, and trembling, as if a single wrong move could snap it entirely. And in truth, it was on the verge of snapping. By evening, exhaustion settled over them like a shroud. Neither spoke, neither moved much. They were physically together, yet emotionally miles apart. Sleep came fitfully, haunted by replayed arguments and imagined betrayals. Dreams were filled with what-ifs and could-have-beens, shadowing the night with sorrow and anxiety. The following days were no better. Patterns established themselves. Arguments over trivial matters, long silences, gestures misinterpreted, words overanalyzed. Every glance was a question, every silence a judgment. And then this new reality, Mabel began to feel a creeping despair. She had always been independent, but now she felt like, afternoon an incident, a minor incident sparked what would be remembered as the turning point of their breakdown. A misfiled document, an overlooked message, a small oversight, something insignificant in isolation, escalated into hours of shouting, crying, and blaming. Peter accused Mabel of carelessness. Mabel accused Peter of being unsympathetic. Each word, each tear, each raised voice deepened the wound. By nightfall, both were drained. They sat across from each other, silence stretching like a chasm. Neither could move closer, neither could turn back. The emotional distance had become a physical presence, a barrier neither knew how to cross. In that silence, they both realized something chilling. The mistakes, once small, had accumulated into a storm neither could easily weather. Love remained, yes, but it was buried under layers of fear, mistrust, and regret. And in that burial, the path forward was obscured, the future uncertain, and the bond that had once seemed unbreakable was now fragile and exposed. By the time the truth came out, their marriage was already standing on one leg. Peter could sense it. He didn't need evidence. He didn't need anyone to tell him. He just knew. The way she avoided his eyes, the way her smile had become a performance, the way the air around them had turned cold, even in the heat of the day. That kind of silence doesn't come from nowhere. It comes from guilt. He didn't confront her at first. He waited. He watched. He prayed. Every night he would sit in the living room long after she had gone to bed, staring at the ceiling, asking himself what he had done wrong. Was he too strict, too predictable, too absent? He kept searching for the version of himself that might have pushed her away. But what he didn't realize was that the moment you start blaming yourself for another person's betrayal, you've already started losing more than love. You're losing your peace.
Mabel, on the other hand, was drowning in her own lies. Every morning she told herself it was over. Every night she told herself she still had control. But guilt doesn't fade with denial. It grows. It follows you in the mirror, in the quiet moments, in the way your husband looks at you and doesn't say a word. The man she had fallen for outside her marriage had promised excitement. He made her feel seen, alive, adored. He told her what she wanted to hear, that she deserved more, that Peter didn't appreciate her, that she had been too loyal to a man who didn't value her. And in her weakest moment, she believed it. But lies wrapped in flattery are still lies, and Mabel was about to learn that lesson in the hardest way possible. One evening, Peter came home earlier than usual. He didn't mean to catch her. He wasn't even looking for proof. He just wanted to surprise her, to talk, to try again. But fate has a way of putting truth right where it hurts. What he saw that evening shattered him. He didn't scream. He didn't throw things. He didn't even cry. He just stood there watching his world fall apart quietly. Sometimes silence is the loudest kind of heartbreak. Mabel froze. The man she was with disappeared, like all cowards do when reality walks in. She tried to speak, but her voice came out small, almost childish. "Peter, I can explain." But there's no explanation for betrayal. There's only damage. For a moment, he looked at her like he didn't even know who she was. And in truth, he didn't. The woman he loved was gone, replaced by a stranger who wore her face. He left that night. No shouting, no threats, no violence, just the sound of the front door closing, slow and final. That sound haunted Mabel for years. At first, she thought he would come back. He was a calm man, a forgiving man. She believed time would heal it. But days turned to weeks, and the silence grew heavier. Peter stopped picking her calls. He stopped replying to her messages. He didn't come home. And when she finally found the courage to go to where he was staying, he didn't open the door. He simply said, "Mabel, please, go home." Those words cut deeper than any insult could, because it meant he had already left her emotionally. The rest was just formality. Mabel's world began to crumble. The man who had promised her excitement vanished from her life as if he'd never existed. Friends she once trusted started to whisper. The looks in church changed, pity mixed with judgment, and she could feel it. That quiet shame that follows you everywhere. She tried to apologize. She begged. She cried. But the thing about betrayal is, once you break trust, love doesn't know how to return home. It stands outside, watching, but it doesn't come back in. Peter wasn't cruel. He just became distant, polite even, the kind of politeness that hurts more than anger. He stopped talking about feelings. He focused on work, on rebuilding himself. He told people he was fine, but no one who's truly fine says it that many times. At night, he would sit alone, thinking about the woman who had once made his world feel complete. He'd remember her laughter, her voice, the way she'd rest her head on his shoulder, and he'd wonder, how does something so beautiful become so painful? How does love turn into regret? There were moments when he wanted to forgive her, moments when he wanted to pick up the phone and tell her to come home. But forgiveness isn't just saying, "I forgive you." It's choosing to trust again. And trust, once broken, becomes something fragile, almost impossible to rebuild. For Mabel, regret became her daily companion. She lost weight, lost friends, lost herself. The mirror no longer showed her a woman full of dreams. It showed a stranger consumed by guilt. Sometimes, late at night, she would whisper to herself, "If only I had waited. If only I had talked to him. If only..." But life doesn't rewind. It only echoes. Months later, they met again, not by plan, but by coincidence. In a small gathering, Peter looked different, calmer, stronger. Mabel's heart sank when she saw him. She wanted to say something, but all the words she had rehearsed vanished. He greeted her with a smile, small, tired, but real. She asked him how he was, and he said he was okay. She nodded. That was all, but in that small moment, she understood. He had moved on, not necessarily to another woman, but to another version of himself that no longer needed her to feel complete. When she got home that night, she cried harder than she ever had before, because that was the moment she truly lost him. Not when he walked out, but when she realized he had healed without her. Sometimes the worst punishment isn't being left. It's watching the person you broke become better without you. Years passed. They lived separate lives. Mabel tried to rebuild, but every relationship that followed carried the ghost of Peter. No one laughed like him. No one loved like him. And no one looked at her with that kind of quiet devotion again. Peter eventually found peace. He forgave her, not for her sake, but for his, because holding on to pain is like drinking poison and hoping someone else will die. He learned to let go, to live again, to smile without pretending. But deep down, in those quiet moments when memories sneak in, he would still wonder if only love had been enough. And that, perhaps, is the cruelest part of all. Not the betrayal itself, but the realization that something once so pure could end so tragically. For Mabel, her biggest mistake was not the affair. It was forgetting that love isn't just a feeling, it's a responsibility. She had protected her pride, her ego, her freedom, but not her marriage. And once trust breaks, no amount of apologies can stitch it back the same way. In the end, their story became a warning. People whispered about it quietly, about how a good marriage can fall apart not because of hate, but because of neglect, pride, and the wrong kind of attention. They say time heals everything. Maybe it does, but some wounds don't close. They just fade into lessons. The worst mistake in marriage is not cheating, not fighting, not shouting. It's forgetting to choose love when it becomes inconvenient. Because once you stop choosing your partner, you've already started losing them.
Time changes everything. It dulls pain, reshapes memories, and teaches lessons that no book ever could. But there are some things time doesn't erase. It only makes you understand them differently. For Peter, healing wasn't a straight road. It was full of nights spent staring at the ceiling, wondering why love can crumble so easily. There were days he hated Mabel, days he missed her, and days he couldn't tell the difference. But little by little, he began to rebuild the pieces of himself that had been tied to her. He learned to find joy in the quiet again, in his morning coffee, in a walk after the rain, in the peace that comes from forgiving even when the other person doesn't deserve it. Forgiveness, he realized, wasn't about letting someone back into your life. It was about letting yourself breathe again. Mabel's journey was different. Regret became her teacher. At first, she tried to run from it, burying herself in work, pretending she was fine, convincing herself she had moved on. But guilt has a way of following you into every silence. It shows up in the way you sigh, in the way you look at happy couples and think, that could have been me. There were nights when she would sit alone, staring at her wedding ring, the one she still kept in a small box by her bedside. It was the only thing she hadn't thrown away, not because she couldn't, but because it reminded her of who she used to be before everything went wrong. Once, she saw Peter at a mutual friend's gathering. He looked at peace, the kind of peace that only comes from acceptance. He wasn't angry anymore. There was no bitterness in his eyes.
And that, more than anything, broke her heart all over again, because she realized she no longer existed in his world, not as a memory, not as a wound, not even as a thought. She wanted to walk up to him, to apologize again, to tell him she still loved him, but she didn't. She simply watched him from across the room, smiling faintly, knowing that some stories don't get second chances. As the months rolled into years, both of them changed. Peter started speaking to younger couples about what he'd learned, about patience, communication, and the danger of silence. He didn't tell them his story outright, but his voice carried the weight of someone who had lived through heartbreak and come out wiser. Mabel found her own way too. She joined a small women's group that helped others heal from broken relationships. It wasn't about finding sympathy, it was about helping others avoid the same path she took. When she spoke, her words carried pain, but also truth. Don't let pride make decisions your heart will regret. And when you find someone who truly loves you, protect that love like your life depends on it, because one day it might. Sometimes she still thought about Peter, especially on quiet evenings when the house felt too empty. She'd imagine how things could have been if she had just been patient, if she had talked instead of withdrawing, if she had fought for what mattered. But if is a cruel word. It changes nothing. Peter, on his part, eventually met someone new. It wasn't fireworks or obsession. It was calm, gentle, and steady, the kind of love that doesn't demand proof, only presence. And for the first time in a long while, he felt safe again. Safe to love, safe to trust, safe to be vulnerable. When he finally married again, it was a quiet ceremony. No crowd, no noise, just peace. He didn't invite Mabel, and she didn't expect to be invited. But she heard about it, and that night she smiled through her tears. She whispered a prayer for him, not out of bitterness, but gratitude. Because sometimes loving someone means accepting that their happiness no longer includes you. Years later, long after the pain had turned into distant memory, their paths crossed one last time, by chance, at a charity event. The room was filled with laughter, music, and life. His smile warmer, her eyes still bright, but softer, like someone who had learned humility through heartbreak. They saw each other across the room. For a brief moment, the world went quiet. No anger, no awkwardness, just two souls who shared something once, something beautiful, something broken, something unforgettable. She walked up to him. He greeted her kindly, and for the first time in years, they talked, not about what happened, but about life, about how things turned out, about peace. When the conversation ended, she said, "Peter, thank you." He smiled gently. "For what?" "For forgiving me, even when I didn't deserve it." He paused, then nodded. "We both learned, and that's enough." As she walked away, she felt something lift off her chest. The years of guilt, the what-ifs, the sorrow, they all felt lighter. Maybe forgiveness had finally reached her too. Later that night, she stood by her window staring at the stars. For the first time in years, she wasn't crying, she wasn't broken, she was simply grateful. Grateful for the lesson, for the love that once was, and for the chance to grow from her worst mistake. Because that's the thing about life. Pain teaches in ways comfort never can. Marriage isn't destroyed by one big mistake, but by 1,000 small ones left unchecked. Pride, silence, neglect, they all pile up until one day someone makes the wrong choice. But the real tragedy isn't in the mistake itself, it's in refusing to learn from it. Peter found peace, Mabel found humility, and in their separate ways, they both found healing. So if you're listening to this and you're holding on to anger or pride or silence, let it go before it's too late. Don't wait for love to become regret. Don't wait to realize what you had when it's already gone. Because the worst mistake in marriage is believing it could never happen to you.